The lights didn't just go out, they were taken from us. The first thing I noticed was the silence, that unnatural kind that replaces the steady hum of machines you trust with your life. Then came the sharp, rhythmic beeping of the ICU monitor running on backup, thin and strained like it was holding its breath along with me. The air smelled faintly of ozone and heated plastic, and my pulse snapped into focus as I turned toward the breaker panel and saw it. Everything had been manually shut down from the outside. I stepped onto my front porch, gravel crunching under my boots, and there she was, Margaret Whitmore, standing perfectly still at the edge of my driveway like she'd been waiting for this moment. Her clipboard tucked under one arm, her smile thin and precise, the kind that never reaches the eyes. "You've been warned multiple times, Dr. Caldwell," she said, her voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "Unauthorized medical-grade equipment violates HOA electrical compliance standards." I stared at her for half a second, trying to process how someone could sound so calm while a man inside that house depended on that power to breathe. And behind me, I could hear the monitor stutter again, that fragile beep echoing through the hallway like a countdown. "That equipment is keeping my father alive," I said, keeping my voice level, because losing control here would only give her more ground. She tilted her head slightly, like she was considering a minor inconvenience, not a human life, and tapped the paper against her palm. "Community rules apply to everyone," she replied, as if that settled it. I could feel the heat rising under my collar, the metallic taste of adrenaline settling on my tongue, but I didn't argue, didn't raise my voice, because something about the way she stood there, so certain, so convinced she had the final say, told me this wasn't a moment for noise. This was a moment for precision. I turned back inside, the air heavier now. Every step toward the ICU room measured against the ticking seconds in my head. And when I reached the doorway, the soft glow of the backup battery lit my father's face in a pale, flickering blue, the machine working harder than it should, buying me time it wasn't designed to give. I pulled out my phone, thumb hovering over a number I hadn't used in months, maybe longer, a line most people don't even know exists, and for a brief second I hesitated, because once I made that call, there was no going back to normal neighborhood disputes and polite warnings. This would escalate, fast and public and irreversible. Outside, I could still hear Margaret shifting her weight on the gravel, waiting, confident that she'd already won. I pressed call. The line connected instantly. No hold music, no delay, just a calm voice on the other end that said my name like it mattered. I gave a single sentence, clear and controlled, and hung up before they could ask anything else. Then I stepped back onto the porch, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the street, and looked at Margaret as she adjusted her sunglasses, already turning as if she had somewhere better to be, like this was just another violation handled. Another neighbor put in line. I checked my watch. 10 minutes, I thought, maybe less. She had no idea what was already moving toward this street. No idea that the same system she thought she could control with paperwork and signatures was about to answer to something much bigger, something that didn't ask permission and didn't care about HOA rules. The distant rumble started low, almost easy to miss, like thunder rolling in from miles away, and I saw her pause, just slightly, her head turning. As the sound grew louder, engines layering over each other, heavy and deliberate. And that was the exact moment her confidence cracked for the first time. The rumble grew heavier, no longer distant, but pressing into the pavement like something alive, and I watched Margaret's posture stiffen as the first truck turned onto our street, a massive utility rig with amber lights spinning in slow, deliberate circles, followed by another, and another, engines idling low and powerful like they owned the ground beneath them. The neighbors started stepping out onto their porches, doors creaking open, conversations cutting off mid-sentence as the convoy rolled in without hesitation, tires crunching over asphalt and gravel, ignoring every neatly painted curb and HOA guideline that Margaret had enforced for years. She took a step forward, lifting her hand like she was about to stop them, like she still believed this was her street to control. But the lead truck did not slow down. It did not even acknowledge her presence. It just kept moving until it reached the center of the block and came to a controlled stop right in front of my house. The smell of diesel filled the air, thick and mechanical, mixing with the fading scent of overheated wiring from inside. and within seconds uniformed technicians stepped out, focused, efficient, already moving toward my property with cables and equipment like they had done this 100 times before. Margaret's voice cut through the noise, sharper now, less polished. "Excuse me, you cannot park those here. This is a restricted residential zone." But no one answered her. Not a glance, not a pause. Just quiet coordination as one of the technicians gave a quick nod toward me and asked, "Dr. Caldwell, we are initiating emergency power override. Confirm critical load priority." And I answered without hesitation, "ICU equipment, full support, no interruption." The words steady even as my heart pounded. Behind me, through the open doorway, I could hear the monitor struggling, that uneven beeping pushing me forward, grounding every decision into something simple and absolute. Cables uncoiled across the lawn, thick lines of reinforced insulation, dragged with purpose, connecting the truck to a temporary distribution unit that looked like it belonged on a disaster site. Not a quiet suburban street where mailboxes matched and grass height was measured to the inch. Margaret stepped closer now, her heels clicking faster against the pavement, the controlled tone gone from her voice, replaced with something tighter, something uncertain. "You cannot just take over community infrastructure without approval," she said, but one of the technicians finally turned, calm and direct, holding up a tablet with authorization codes displayed in bold, official lettering. "State emergency protocol, ma'am. This area is now designated critical support." And that was. The moment I saw it, the exact second her certainty fractured. She looked around as if expecting someone to back her up, someone to reinforce the authority she had built over this neighborhood. But all she found were her own neighbors watching in silence, their attention shifting away from her and toward the trucks, the cables, the undeniable scale of what was happening. Another engine roared to life, deeper this time, and the generator engaged with a low, steady hum that vibrated through the ground. And inside the house the monitor sound changed, stabilizing, stronger now, the fragile rhythm replaced with something consistent, reliable, alive. I took a slow breath, the tension in my chest easing just enough to think clearly again. And when I looked back at Margaret, she was no longer standing tall with that practiced smile. She was staring at the trucks, at the men who did not answer to her, at the system she could not control, and I realized she still did not understand the full picture. Not yet, not even close, because this was only the first step of what I had just set in motion. The steady hum of the generator settled into the bones of the street, deep and constant, like a second heartbeat replacing the fragile rhythm that had almost slipped away. And inside the house the ICU monitor answered with a clean, confident tone that cut through everything else, stronger now, stable, alive. And I stood there for a moment just listening, letting that sound anchor me before I stepped back onto the porch where the real shift was still unfolding. Margaret had not moved far, but something in her stance had changed, her shoulders tighter, her clipboard hanging lower at her side like it had suddenly lost weight, and her eyes kept flicking between the trucks, the cables, and the technicians who moved with quiet authority that did not need to announce itself. "This is excessive," she said finally, her voice sharper. "Trying to rebuild control. You cannot just override a residential grid because of one house." But even as she spoke, another vehicle pulled up, this one marked with state utility insignia, doors opening with a heavy click as two officials stepped out carrying tablets and sealed documents. They did not approach her, not at first. They walked straight past, boots firm against the pavement, heading toward me as if the path had already been decided long before they arrived. One of them nodded once, professional and precise. "Dr. Caldwell, we are expanding the emergency designation to the full block to stabilize load distribution." And I felt the weight of that sentence settle into place. Because this was no longer just about keeping one room powered. This was about controlling the entire system that fed it. Margaret stepped forward again, faster this time, intercepting their path, her voice rising just enough to draw every neighbor's attention. "You need HOA authorization for any changes affecting community infrastructure," she insisted, holding her clipboard like it was still a shield. But the official did not slow down, did not argue. He simply stopped long enough to meet her gaze and said, calm and unshaken, "Ma'am, this area is now under state emergency jurisdiction. Local association policies are temporarily suspended." And then he kept walking. The words hung in the air longer than the engine noise, heavier than anything that had been said so far, and I watched as Margaret's grip tightened around that clipboard, her knuckles whitening, her mouth opening slightly as if she was about to respond, but finding nothing that would land. Across the street, I could see neighbors exchanging looks, quiet conversations starting in low tones, the kind that spread fast when people realize something bigger than their usual rules has just taken over. The technicians were already repositioning cables, rerouting lines with deliberate efficiency, and then I noticed something that made the full picture click into place, a secondary panel being installed at the edge of the street, labeled priority allocation. And I knew exactly what that meant before anyone said it out loud. A moment later, one of the crew members called out a confirmation, non-critical loads will be cycled down to maintain stability. And there it was, the line that separated essential from optional, necessity from convenience. Margaret heard it too. I saw it in the way her head snapped toward the panel, the way her eyes widened just a fraction as realization finally began to catch up with her, and she turned back to me, searching my face like she was trying to find some sign that this could still be negotiated, still be contained. I did not say anything. I did not need to, because the system was already moving, already making decisions that did not involve her. And somewhere down the block, a porch light flickered once, then went dark, followed by another. And another, a quiet chain reaction rolling outward as the grid adjusted itself in real time, prioritizing what mattered most. And for the first time since I stepped outside, Margaret Whitmore looked like someone who understood she was no longer in control of anything happening on this street. The darkness spread unevenly, not like a failure, but like a decision, house by house, line by line. Lights dimming in places that had never known anything but steady power, and the low murmur of confusion rolled through the neighborhood as porch lights flickered out and garage doors stopped mid-motion, frozen halfway open like they had been caught in the act. I could hear voices now, distant at first, then closer, neighbors stepping onto driveways, phones in hand, trying switches that no longer answered them. And through all of it, the generator behind me held steady, its deep mechanical hum cutting clean through the uncertainty like a line drawn in concrete. Inside my house, the ICU monitor responded in perfect rhythm, the sound full and consistent now, no longer strained. And I let that anchor me again before turning back to the street where the real shift was becoming impossible to ignore. Margaret stood near the curb, no longer commanding the space but reacting to it, her eyes moving rapidly from one darkened house to another as if she could reverse it just by watching closely enough. And when she finally spoke, the sharpness in her voice had changed into something tighter, something edged with disbelief. "You are shutting down the entire block for one property," she said, louder now, not just to me, but to anyone who would listen. But the response did not come from me. One of the state officials stepped forward, tablet in hand, and spoke clearly, not raising his voice, but making sure it carried. "Load balancing is required to maintain critical medical support. Ma'am, non-essential circuits are temporarily deactivated." And the phrasing was deliberate, technical, final. A man 2 houses down called out, asking what was happening. Another voice followed, questioning why their air conditioning had cut off. And I could feel the attention shifting, not toward me, but toward the system that had just redrawn the rules of the street. Margaret tried to step into that gap, lifting her clipboard again like it could still organize the chaos. "This community has regulations, there are procedures," she insisted, but the words landed differently now, lighter, almost hollow against the reality unfolding around her. I watched as one of the technicians adjusted the distribution panel, his movements precise, practiced, and a row of indicator lights shifted from amber to green, confirming stability, confirming priority. And at the edge of my vision, I saw something else, something small but unmistakable. The lights in Margaret's own house flickered once, held for a second, then went completely dark. She turned immediately, the reaction instinctive, her head snapping toward her front windows as if she could will them back on. And for the first time since I had known her, she did not speak right away. The silence from her was louder than anything she had said before. I took a step down from the porch, gravel crunching underfoot, and the air felt different now, less tense, more defined, like everything had finally settled into its proper place. The official glanced at his tablet again, then at me, giving a small confirming nod, and I understood what it meant without needing words. The system was stable, the ICU load was secured, the priority had been locked in. Behind me, the steady beep of the monitor continued without interruption, a quiet reminder of what all of this was actually about. And when I looked back at Margaret, she was still staring at her darkened house, her reflection faint in the window glass, her authority reduced to something that no longer reached beyond her own front door. She turned slowly, her expression no longer controlled, no longer certain. And in that moment it was clear she was finally seeing the difference between the power she thought she had and the power that had just answered my call. And I knew this was not the end of it. Not for her, not for what she had done, because systems like this did not just respond. They recorded, they documented, and they followed through the street, settled into a strange new rhythm. Not quiet, but controlled, like every sound had been filtered through something bigger than any one person standing there. And I could feel the shift in the way people moved, the way conversations lowered into careful tones instead of casual complaints. The generator behind me continued its steady output, a constant presence now. And inside the house, the ICU monitor answered with perfect consistency, each tone clean, deliberate, alive, and I let that sound guide my focus as I stepped fully off the porch and onto the driveway, the gravel firm under my boots. Margaret had not regained her voice yet, but I could see it building again in the way she straightened her posture, the way she adjusted her grip on the clipboard like she was reconstructing her authority piece by piece, even as the evidence around her contradicted it. "This is not over," she said finally, her tone lower, controlled again, but no longer confident. "There will be consequences for bypassing community governance." And for a moment the words hung there, familiar, the kind of language she had used on everyone else for years. But now they sounded smaller, like they no longer reached beyond her own expectations. One of the state officials glanced at his tablet again, scrolling through data that reflected every decision made in the last 15 minutes, every switch, every override, every allocation, and then he looked up, his expression neutral but precise. "Ma'am, all actions taken here are logged under emergency medical protocol, including the initial disruption." And that last phrase landed with weight, because it reframed everything, not just what was happening now, but what had started it. I saw Margaret's eyes flick toward him, then back to me, searching, calculating, trying to understand how far this extended, how much of her decision had already been captured in a system she could not influence. Across the street, a neighbor spoke up, asking if the power would return soon, and the technician responded calmly, explaining that restoration would follow once critical stability was maintained, his tone measured, informative, nothing like the warnings Margaret used to deliver, and that contrast alone shifted the balance further. I walked a few steps closer to the curb, not rushing, not aggressive, just present, and the air felt cooler now as the sun dipped lower, shadows stretching longer across the pavement, and for the first time since this started, I spoke again, my voice even, controlled, carrying just enough to be heard without forcing it. "You shut down a medical system without verifying what it supported," I said, not accusing, just stating a fact, and she opened her mouth to respond. But nothing came out right away. The weight of it had changed, the simplicity of the truth cutting through all the layered rules and procedures she had relied on. Behind me, the steady hum of the generator and the clean rhythm of the monitor continued, a quiet confirmation that the system was doing exactly what it was designed to do, protecting what mattered most. The official tapped a few more commands into his tablet, and I noticed another update roll through the panel, a confirmation log, locking in the incident, time-stamped, categorized, recorded in a way that would not fade with memory or opinion. Margaret saw it too. I could tell by the way her focus snapped to the screen, the way her breathing shifted just slightly as the realization deepened. This was not just a moment she could argue her way out of. It was a record that would follow her beyond this street, beyond this neighborhood. The conversations around us continued, low but constant, neighbors piecing together what had happened, what had been done, and more importantly, why. And the story was no longer centered on HOA rules or violations. It had moved into something else entirely, something bigger, something undeniable. I stood there, steady, listening to the system hold, watching the street adjust, and knowing this was only the midpoint of what had been set in motion, Because once a system like this responded, it did not simply reset. It reviewed, it escalated, and it made sure the same mistake did not happen twice. The air felt different now, not tense but settled into something deliberate. Like every system in place had chosen its side and committed to it, and I could see it in the way the technicians moved. With less urgency and more precision, fine-tuning rather than reacting, confirming rather than guessing. The generator maintained its steady output behind me, that deep mechanical hum now part of the environment, and inside the house the ICU monitor answered with unwavering consistency, each tone clean and measured, no longer fighting to hold on, but simply doing its job. And that sound carried through the open doorway like proof that everything happening out here had a purpose beyond control or authority. I watched as one of the state officials stepped aside, speaking quietly into his radio, his tone low but clear, relaying details that I knew would not stop at this street, not at this block, but would move upward through channels designed to respond to exactly this kind of failure. Margaret stood a few feet away, her posture no longer rigid but not relaxed either, caught somewhere between resistance and realization. And when she finally spoke again, her voice had lost its edge, replaced with something more careful. "This could have been handled differently," she said, as if reframing the situation might shrink it back down to something manageable. But the official closest to her did not look up from his tablet as he responded. "Ma'am, interruption of registered medical support triggers automatic escalation. There is no alternative pathway once that threshold is crossed." And the words were not harsh, not confrontational, just factual, like a line drawn long before. Either of us stepped outside. A neighbor down the street approached cautiously, asking if there was any danger, his voice uncertain but respectful, and the technician reassured him calmly, explaining that the system was stable, that the adjustments were temporary, that essential services were being protected. And I could see the difference in how people received that, how they nodded, stepped back, trusted the process in a way they never had with HOA notices and warnings. I took a slow breath, the cool evening air settling in my lungs, and for the first time since the power had been cut, my thoughts stretched beyond the immediate moment, beyond the house, beyond the street, because I knew what came. Next was not visible, not loud, but far more permanent. The official finished his call and turned slightly toward me, his expression still composed, but there was a subtle shift there, an acknowledgement that what had happened here was not just resolved, it was documented, categorized, and already moving through systems that did not forget. Margaret noticed it too. I could see her watching him, trying to read something she no longer had access to, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of her clipboard as if it could still anchor her in a process she understood. "What happens now?" she asked, not demanding this time, but asking, and the change in that alone said more than anything else. The official met her gaze briefly, then answered in the same calm tone. "Now the review process begins," and that was it. No elaboration, no warning, just a statement of sequence, of inevitability. The street remained dim in places, light in others, a controlled imbalance that served a purpose. And I could feel the weight of that design, the intention behind every switch and every circuit, and it reinforced something simple and undeniable. This was never about winning an argument or proving a point. It was about protecting something that did not get a second chance. Behind me, the steady rhythm of the monitor continued without interruption, a quiet constant in a moment that had shifted everything around it. And as I stood there, watching the technicians finalize their adjustments and the officials log their last entries, I understood that Margaret Whitmore had not just lost control of this street for a few hours. She had triggered something that would outlast this night, something that would follow her decisions wherever they were recorded, wherever they were reviewed. And there was nothing she could say, no rule she could cite, that would undo the fact that when it mattered most, her authority had failed against a system designed to keep people alive. The street no longer felt like a neighborhood. It felt like a controlled zone, every movement deliberate, every sound carrying weight. And I could see it in the way the technicians began packing slower, not rushing, just confirming that everything they had put in place would hold long after they left. The generator continued its low, steady hum. But now it sounded less like an intrusion and more like a safeguard, something temporary but absolute. And inside the house, the ICU monitor answered with the same calm, unwavering rhythm, a quiet reminder that the system was doing exactly what it was designed to do. I stepped a little closer to the curb, watching as one of the officials sealed a digital report on his tablet, his finger pressing down with finality. And even though there was no dramatic announcement, no raised voice, I knew that action carried more weight than anything said out loud, because once it was logged, it existed beyond interpretation, beyond denial. Margaret stood just off to the side now, no longer trying to intercept anyone, no longer stepping into conversations that were not hers anymore. Her clipboard still in her hand, but unused, almost forgotten, and when she finally spoke again, it was quieter, directed more toward me than the street. "You made this bigger than it needed to be," she said, but there was no conviction behind it, no authority, just an attempt to reshape something that had already been defined. I looked at her for a moment, not with anger, not even with satisfaction, just with clarity. Because the difference between what she believed she controlled and what had actually responded here was no longer theoretical. It was visible in every darkened window and every powered line that led back to my house. One of the technicians walked past us carrying coiled cable, pausing just long enough to say, "System will remain active until full restoration is approved." His tone neutral, procedural, and then he kept moving, because to him this was not personal. It was protocol. A neighbor approached Margaret then, hesitant but direct, asking why their power had been cut, and I watched as she opened her mouth, searching for the language she had always used, the rules, the regulations, the structured responses, but none of it fit anymore, not in this context, not against what everyone had just witnessed. She glanced at me again, briefly, and in that moment I saw something I had not seen before, not anger, not arrogance, but uncertainty, the kind that comes when the framework you rely on no longer applies. The official finished his final check and signaled to the crew, a small gesture, almost invisible, but it carried through immediately as the team shifted into a new phase, stabilization complete, monitoring ongoing. And I understood that this was the point where the situation moved from response to review, from action to consequence. The sky had dimmed further now, evening settling in, and the contrast between the lit interior of my home and the darker street around it made the line even clearer, what was protected and what was not, what was essential and what could wait. Margaret took a slow breath, her shoulders lowering slightly, as if something in her had finally accepted that this was no longer hers to manage, and when she spoke again, it was almost to herself. "I was enforcing the rules," she said, but even she seemed to hear how small that sounded against everything else. I did not respond, because there was nothing to add. The system had already answered for me. And as the technicians secured their equipment and the officials finalized their reports, I knew that what had happened here would not fade into a simple dispute. It would be reviewed, measured, and followed through in ways that did not depend on who spoke the loudest or held the clipboard. And Margaret Whitmore, standing there in the dim light of her own powerless house, was just beginning to understand that the consequences of her decision had already moved far beyond her reach. The night settled fully over the street, but it was not the kind of darkness people were used to. It was structured, intentional, broken only by the steady glow coming from my house and the industrial lights mounted on the generator rigs, casting long shadows that stretched across lawns that had always been perfectly lit and perfectly controlled. The air carried the low hum of machinery and the quiet murmur of neighbors still trying to understand what had just unfolded. And I could see them standing in small groups now, no longer looking at Margaret for answers, but glancing toward the trucks, toward the officials, toward the system that had taken over without asking permission. Inside, the ICU monitor continued its steady rhythm, each tone clear and consistent, and that sound grounded everything, reminding me why none of this could have been handled any other way. One of the officials stepped closer to the distribution panel again, reviewing the live data feed, and I watched the screen reflect real-time allocation, critical circuits locked, non-essential zones suspended, every line accounted for with a level of precision that made arguments irrelevant. Margaret stood near the edge of her driveway, the silhouette of her house behind her now completely dark, and she looked smaller than she had just an hour ago, not physically, but in presence, like the space she once filled had been replaced by something far more concrete and far less negotiable. She spoke again, but this time her voice did not carry, It stayed close, almost contained. How long will this last? She asked, and there was no accusation in it, just uncertainty. The official did not hesitate. Until full restoration is authorized and the incident review is completed, he said. The same calm tone, the same measured delivery, and I could see the words settle into her, not as something to argue with, but something to absorb. A neighbor approached me then, cautious but respectful, asking quietly if everything was stable now, and I nodded once, keeping my voice even as I answered. The system is holding, and that was enough, because the evidence was already there in the steady glow from my windows and the absence of flicker in the lights that mattered. Behind us, a technician secured another connection, tightening it with practiced precision, and the panel responded with a soft click, a confirmation that everything was locked into place for the long run. Margaret turned her head slightly, watching that motion, and I could tell she was piecing it together, understanding that this was not temporary chaos. It was controlled response, designed to outlast the problem that triggered it. The conversations across the street shifted again, quieter now, less confusion and more recognition, people understanding that what had happened here was not random, not excessive, but necessary, and that realization moved through the neighborhood faster than any official explanation could. I took a slow breath, the cool air settling deeper now, and let my focus move from the street back toward the house, because for the first time since this began, I could think beyond the immediate moment, beyond the response, toward what came next. The officials had already begun that process, logging, reviewing, escalating, and I knew those steps would continue long after the trucks left and the lights returned to normal, because systems like this did not reset without learning, did not move on without addressing the cause. Margaret shifted her weight again, looking from her darkened home to the illuminated equipment that had replaced her control, and in that quiet movement I saw the final piece settle into place, not defeat, not even acceptance, but awareness, the kind that comes when the structure you relied on is revealed to be smaller than you believed. The generator continued its steady output, unwavering, and the ICU monitor answered in perfect time, and as I stood there, watching the street exist under a different set of rules than it had that morning, I knew that when the power finally returned, when everything looked normal again, nothing about this situation would actually be the same by the time the first streetlight flickered back on. It did not feel like a victory. It felt like a conclusion that had already been written the moment the system took over, slow and deliberate as power returned in controlled phases, one section at a time, never touching the lines that had been marked as critical, never interrupting the steady hum behind me or the consistent rhythm inside my house. The generator did not shut down immediately. It stayed engaged, holding its ground like it did not trust the grid to carry the weight just yet, and I respected that, because neither did I. The officials remained where they were, not rushing, not celebrating, just observing as data stabilized across their screens, confirming what the system already knew, that priority had been maintained, that the failure had been contained, and that the response had held exactly as designed. Across the street, lights returned to houses one by one, soft glows filling windows that had gone dark not long ago, and the quiet conversations shifted again, less confusion now, more understanding, people recognizing that what had happened here was not random, not excessive, but precise, calculated, necessary. Margaret stood at the edge of her driveway as the light inside her house finally came back, a faint glow behind her that should have restored something familiar, something comfortable, but it did not, because the shift had already happened, not in the electricity, but in what it represented. She looked at the light, then at the trucks, then at me, and there was no clipboard raised this time, no rules cited, no attempt to reclaim the space she once controlled, just a quiet realization settling in, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be understood. One of the officials stepped forward, closing out the final sequence on his tablet, and his voice carried just enough to be heard. Emergency protocol complete, system transitioning back to standard operations, incident review remains active. And that last part stayed with me, because it meant this was not finished, not in the way that mattered. The technicians began disconnecting equipment with the same precision they had used to deploy it, coiling cables, securing panels, every movement efficient, practiced, and temporary. like they were erasing their physical presence while leaving everything else exactly where it needed to be. I turned slightly toward the house, listening to the ICU monitor continue its steady tone. Unchanged, unaffected by the transition happening outside. And that sound told me everything I needed to know, that the system had done its job, that the line between essential and non-essential had held firm when it mattered most. Margaret took a step back toward her front door, slower now, her movements measured, and before she turned away completely, she glanced once more at the street, at the trucks that were already beginning to pull out, at the neighbors who no longer looked to her for direction, and at the quiet order that had replaced her version of control. She did not say anything, and neither did I, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to prove. The difference had already been made clear in a way that words could not change. As the last generator truck eased forward and the deep hum began to fade, replaced by the softer, familiar sounds of a normal street returning, I stood there for a moment longer, feeling the shift settle into place, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. The lights were back, the street looked the same, but everything underneath it had changed, because authority is not measured by who enforces the most rules. It is measured by what still stands when those rules fail. And as I turned back toward the steady glow of the ICU room, I knew one thing with complete clarity: power does not argue, it decides.